I'd like to introduce the sermon with a little bit of a story. President James A. Garfield had been in office for only 4 months when he was shot at a train station in Washington, D.C., en route to a class reunion. Now, wasn't he from East Aurora? He was. In fact, if you drive through East Aurora, you'll see signs to President Garfield's childhood home. So he was actually headed on up here to Buffalo when he was shot there in Washington. For weeks, he hovered between life and death. The worried nation discovered an old hymn entitled, "Master, the Tempest is Raging." And it was sung from coast to coast over and over again, and it gave comfort to all of America. The hymn was written by a woman at the end of her rope, Mary Ann Baker. Her family had been devastated by a certain disease. Her father and mother had died from it. She herself was bedridden with it. And then finally, her beloved brother, her younger brother, fell ill. Hoping to find a cure, he left Chicago and traveled to a warmer climate. For weeks, the telegrams flew back and forth between brother and sister until the last telegram came telling her of his death. "I've always tried to believe in God," she said, "and give the Master a consecrated life, but this is more than I can bear. What have I done to deserve this? God does not care for me." Gradually, God brought some relief and understanding into her mind, and she acquiesced to his will. A great peace filled her soul, one she could scarcely describe. And shortly thereafter, in 1874, a friend asked Mary to write a song to go along with a Sunday school lesson about Mark chapter 4, verses 37 through 39, the account of Christ calming the sea. Mary hesitated at first. She was familiar with the superb 14th century hymn on this text, and the words were still popular in her day. The words of that old hymn were, "Fierce was the wild billow, dark was the night. Oars labored heavily, foam glimmered white. Trembled the mariners, peril was nigh. Then said the God, Peace, it is I." She very much wanted an opportunity to express the inner peace that God had given her, so Mary had learned that God sometimes stills frightened disciples, even though he sometimes lets them endure the raging elements. And so out of her own experience, and from her study of Mark chapter 4, came the words which a few years later comforted a mourning nation. I will attempt to sing the first stanza. "Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high. The sky is o'ershadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Carest not that we perish, how can thou lie asleep, when each moment so madly is threatening a grave in the angry deep? The winds and the waves shall obey thy will, peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons, or man, or whatever it be, no waters can swallow the ship where lies the Master of ocean, earth, and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will, peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will, peace, peace be still." In our life, we endure great tempests, storms, and trials. Looking out on this audience, there's not one set of eyes I can look at where you and I have not gone through some kind of difficulty. It's interesting, the account there in Mark chapter 4, the disciples of Jesus Christ, they were veteran fishermen. They had spent their entire lives on the Sea of Galilee. They had seen storms. They had seen many storms in their day. This was unlike any other. It was a great tribulation. It was a severe trial to the point where they were afraid. This one was different. It was harder than the rest. It was scarier than the rest. It was a trial. What are trials? And why do we have to go through them? What instruction does God give us about enduring them? Today we're going to look at everything you could possibly ever want to know about trials. Now I say that tongue-in-cheek, because obviously there is no way in 60 minutes we can talk about everything that you could ever possibly want to know about trials. But let me tell you here and now, brethren, there is a purpose for the difficulties that you're enduring. There is a great purpose for the loss of a loved one, the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse. There's a purpose behind great health trials. This is not something that happens randomly just to punish us. There is a purpose. So today what I'd like to do in the time that I have is examine what a trial is. In case you didn't know what a trial is, I'm going to explain what a trial is. We're going to talk about what the characteristics of a trial are. They have some things in common. We'll talk a little bit about how to endure trials. We'll talk a little bit about why God commands us to rejoice in trials. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be delivered from a trial. So, the title of my sermon again, Everything You Could Ever Possibly Want to Know About Trials. Now, the reason I'm doing that multiple times is so that Mrs. Seiler can get it down for the church report, so that Mrs. Clothier can get it down for the church report, so that it can be on the label of the video. Okay. Point number one, what is a trial? What is a trial? From the International Bible Encyclopedia. It's interesting. Actually, I'll do it this way. I have a tool on my workbench at home. I have a bunch of tools. Of course, they're not put away. They're all in a big pile. But I have a tool on my workbench that's always there because it's screwed onto the top of my workbench. It's a really interesting device. It actually has two large metal pieces. And these two large metal pieces are opposed to one another, but a screw, which is an incline, has attached these two pieces together. And when I turn a slight lever with a little bit of pressure, these two huge metal plates move closer and closer and closer together. And if I were to leave my finger in there and keep turning that lever, I would crush my finger. It's called a vise. And if I unscrew it, it widens. And so you all know what a vise is. You've seen it before. What is a vise for? Simply put, a vise is for putting pressure on something to hold it in place. The definition of a trial, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, is this. It's interesting. If you look up the word trial almost always in the Bible refers to the courtroom proceedings. The word that's most commonly used is the word tribulation. So if you look up the word tribulation, which is a trial, definitely, it's the Hebrew word sar, S-A-R, and it means trouble. Trouble with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. No, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do the Music Man. It means the word trouble. The Greek word is thalipsis. T-H-I-L-I-P-I-S, thalipsis, and it means affliction or pressure. In the Authorized Version, sometimes the word is translated travail, affliction, be afflicted, distress, punishment, suffering, and so on. This is what it goes on to say. It says, the Hebrew word sar and the Greek word thalipsis derive its roots from a graphic portrayal of the process in which a person is first limited, then walled in, and gradually squeezed until something must give. A trial is something that limits us, walls us in, and gradually squeezes us until something must give. Why on earth would God limit us, wall us in, and squeeze us to the point where something has to give? Why would God allow us to go through trials? Sometimes the tribulation is seen as punishment for sin. Sometimes as a part of life, to be expected and tolerated. Sometimes it's by God's grace and a cause of rejoicing. The forces that apply such pressure could be political enemies, personal enemies, predictable troubles in life, times of extreme crisis, health issues, financial issues. Any of those things could cause squeezing. Wall us in, apply pressure. There is a great tribulation which will limit, wall in, and squeeze all of mankind until something gives. Now, the Easton Bible Dictionary is a whole lot simpler. It defines a trial or tribulation as hardships that try our faith. Hardships that try our faith. So whether you want to think of a trial or a tribulation as being caught in a vice grip that causes pressure, or whether it's simply a hardship that tries our faith, a trial has a purpose. Let's look at a couple of the characteristics. First, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Some of the characteristics of a trial. So we know what it is. It's something that applies pressure, that tests our faith or tests our character until something gives. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Second Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 8. One characteristic of trials is that many times they are severe. Many times they are severe. Do you know why? It's the word pressure. If I were to put a board in my vice grip and not tighten it and then try and take the saw to it, what would happen? It would jumble all over the place. You have to apply pressure. The more pressure, the more severe. The more pressure, the more it holds. Sometimes trials can be severe. Sometimes they're just annoying. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. We do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired of life. There are times when you will face a trial where you will wonder, why am I still alive? God, just let me die. I've heard some of you say that before. I don't know why God's kept me alive. He says we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that He still delivers us. We believe in a God who will deliver us from our great difficulties, from our great trials. So one of the characteristics of trials, brethren, sometimes is that they can be very severe. Another characteristic is that we don't know where they come from. Sometimes it's completely unknown. One minute you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof, the next minute something happens to you. Your whole worldview has changed. There was a servant of God who, according to the Word, was perfect, spiritually mature. He did everything right. He took the poor into his home. He helped people. He donated. He gave things. He was a faithful servant of God. He offered sacrifices and all the rest. And out of the clear blue sky, all of his kids die. And while that servant is telling him, oh, by the way, your kids have died, in the very breath, another servant comes up and says, all of your cattle is gone. You're financially ruined. Out of the clear blue sky. Another servant comes up and says, it was a clear blue sky, and lightning came down and burned up all your crops. There is nothing left. Of course, we're talking about the servant Job, aren't we? As far as Job was concerned, everything was fine. Until out of the clear, this trial came upon him completely unawares. How many of you have ever had a note or message from God with a little menu list on it? Trial of the week. Choose one. Here's a little checkbox. Okay, I'll take a financial trial. No, I don't want a health trial. I can't handle that. I'll take this one. Guess what? It doesn't work that way, does it? The pressure that God applies to us is not of our choosing sometimes. The pressure that God allows us to undergo is not of our choosing. Now, you can write down as a reference Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. Verses 7 through 22, and go back and read that story about the encounter between God and Satan, and about Job and how it came down upon him. He had no clue what was the cause of his difficulties. All right, bear with me one second. I think I got an extra page of my notes. Okay. Monica, I think there should be a copy of my notes right there. Otherwise, I'm going to have to borrow yours, Mrs. Domagala, because my page 5 is missing. I'm sitting there saying, I got half of a verse. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Okay, so there we go. Sometimes our trials are physical, aren't they? Sometimes they're mental. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. Now, this is the verse that Jeff Lawrissey, the fellow down there in Liberty, and I were discussing. He has a hideous leg infection. He has an infection called MRSA. And if you know anything about, it's half a step off from flesh-eating bacteria, basically. So he has this thorn in the flesh. He's asked to be anointed. And then he called me back and he says, well, God decided not to heal me. I said, really? He said, yes, I'm not healed yet. And I said, okay, we need to talk some more. Because when God promises to heal, what does he not promise? He doesn't promise when he's going to do it. The promise to heal is unconditional. But sometimes you may die from your affliction and not be healed until the resurrection. And if God is in the process of squeezing you and walling you in and putting in that vice and turning it so that something gives, usually it's our own self-will, our own pride, our own arrogance, whatever it is that has to give before that trial is done, sometimes it takes time for that to happen. Sometimes it's the matter of developing patience. Okay, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger from Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. So Paul had some kind of a messenger in the flesh. He had some kind of an affliction. Now, we've speculated that it had to do with his vision because, he complains about having to write in a big hand. He complains about having to use other people to write letters and so on. And so sometimes we've thought that maybe he had, macular degeneration and he couldn't read or he couldn't write. Maybe he had, weepy eyes or something. Who knows what the deal was? It says, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. It didn't say he prayed about it 3 times. He pleaded with the Lord 3 times. He prayed a number of times. But he pleaded with God 3 times, I'm sure, that it might depart from me. And God said, no. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. But God, this trial hurts. My grace is sufficient for you. But God, I don't want to go through this anymore. My grace is sufficient for you. And then notice the second half of the verse. It says, my strength, God says, is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, when I am tried, when I am going through difficulties, when I do not feel 10 foot tall and bulletproof, then I am strong. If you are undergoing a trial, brethren, it should not surprise you. Obviously, we all know what 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12 says. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. It simply says, all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution, which is a hideous trial. That persecution may come from your coworkers, it may come from your spouse, it may come from your parents, your children. Point number 2, what is the purpose of trials? Now that we know what they are, it's something that God uses to apply pressure to us so that something must give. It has certain characteristics that sometimes they're severe, sometimes it's physical, and so on. What is the purpose of trials? What is the purpose of it? All right, Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. Why do we have to go through trials? The closest analogy I can describe, my father used to be a pilot. And he described flying as perpetual boredom interrupted by very brief moments of sheer terror. Takeoff and landing are moments of absolute terror. So it's perpetual boredom, interrupted by brief moments of sheer terror. The Christian life is perpetual terror and trials and difficulties, interrupted by brief moments of peace. There are times when we feel like, you know what, things are going well right now. I don't have any severe trials. I'm not going through any great difficulties. Enjoy it. But consider, in the day of adversity, mourn. In the day of rejoicing, rejoice. But consider, God has set one by the other that we might know our days. That's from the book of Ecclesiastes. I forget to write down the verse. All right, Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. We've been justified. We've been made right. Even though we are sinners, even though we know we are sinners, even though God knows we are sinners, we are justified. I used to teach typing a long time ago. They had typewriters before word processors. And one of the things we used to always tell the students is you've got to justify your margins. They've got to be made right. That's what that means. We've been justified through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have access by God, through whom we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand. We rejoice in hope of the glory of God, and not only that, but we glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces something. We don't go through trials for no reason. It produces something. It produces, in this case, the word is perseverance. The Greek word for perseverance is huponome, and it means cheerful endurance. You ever seen a person running a marathon? Person participating in an Ironman or something? Sometimes their faces are absolutely tortured. It's a rare thing to see somebody smiling as they're going through that. But this word is talking about cheerful endurance. You ever notice how some Christians, you go up to them and you say, how's it going? Oh, I got this, I got that, I got that. And it's kind of like, okay, I understand. But is that cheerful? Now, there are times when I don't feel very cheerful. And there's some of you, bless your hearts in this congregation. I'm looking at one of them right now who always asks me, how are you doing? And I know he really cares. It means a lot to me. But I do not want to burden you with all the stuff, right? it says, knowing this, that we glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces cheerful endurance. And cheerful endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because the love of God, which is the result of all these things, the love of God is poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, which God has given us. The result of trials, brethren, is hope and love. So one of the purposes of trials is to produce cheerful endurance. Notice 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. Another reason why we have to go through trials, because we're Christians. But besides that, 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. If you're going through a trial, if you're going through a difficulty, Jeff's concern, my acquaintance down there in Liberty, is he said, I could die from this. And I'm only just now starting to obey God. What happens if I die before I get it right? He's concerned. He's facing his possible death. And I keep telling him, I said, Jeff, God is more interested in your eternal life than He is in your comfort. He said, but sometimes the pain's unbearable. I said, when it is, what should you do? He said, pray, I guess. I said, what else can you do? I said, read the Scriptures and pray. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been grieved by various trials. The word grieved means to suffer a loss. That you have been grieved by various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, even though it's tested by fire. What's gold selling for right now? How many ridiculous dollars per ounce? And God says that faith, real faith, genuine faith, is more valuable. Try going to some gold buyer and say, oh, I've got faith. That's more valuable than gold. Yeah, try and put it in a ring, he's going to say. If need be, we are grieved by various trials, so that the genuineness of our faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, even though it's purified by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Christ. So one of the purposes of trials is to produce perseverance. Another purpose of trials is to produce genuineness of faith. One of the purposes of our trials is to improve our faith. When you put something in that vise and you turn that knob, sooner or later something's going to give. Well, in this case, what gives is our self-will, the thing in us that prevents us from having faith. All right, Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, just over a couple of pages in my Bible. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 10. Hebrews 12, verse 10. Talking about us being corrected by our fathers. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 10, it says, they indeed, our fathers, chastened us for a few days, or a lifetime. 21 years seems like a lifetime, right, Alex? Okay, they chastened us for a few days as seems best to them, but God does it for our profit, so that we might be partakers of His holiness. So we're corrected by God so that we can be partakers of His holiness. No chastening, no correction, no trial, no being put in a vice grip and turned tight is pleasant. No chastening is joyful at the present. It's painful. Ask Wayne Kester about pain. I could run down the list, so I shouldn't have even gone there, because all of us know about pain. And some people have pain that's unimaginable. Some of us have really low thresholds. Some people deal with pain in such a perpetual state that the rest of us, we would go stark raving mad if we had some of the pain that these people do. No chastening seems joyful at the present. It's painful. Nevertheless, afterward, as a result of the trial, it produces the peaceable fruit of righteousness. So one of the purposes of trials is to produce righteousness. So it produces cheerful endurance. It produces faith. It produces righteousness. Do you want cheerful endurance? Do you want faith? Do you want righteousness? Well, guess what? You're asking for trials. Be careful what you ask for. You might get it. Hebrews chapter 5. Going back to Hebrews chapter 5. The main reason, brethren, why we have to go through trials is because we're no better than Jesus Christ. We aren't any better than Jesus Christ. Now, I know that may be shocking to some. We're not better than Jesus Christ. If He had to go through trials, how dare we think we don't have to? Hebrews chapter 5, starting in verse 6. Hebrews 5, verse 6. He says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the likeness of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness." Tzedek is righteousness. Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. You are a priest forever according to the order or likeness of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications, and all of John chapter 17 is an example of one of his prayers, right? When we read John 17, we're reading the prayer of Jesus Christ. When he was here in the flesh, he offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears. We read that his blood, his sweat became like drops of blood. His prayers were so intense that that's what it was like. He offered up tears and cries to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his godly fear. There you go. And even though he was a son, he learned obedience by the things he suffered. He learned obedience from trials. He who was righteous, he who had faith, he who had endurance, learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Why do we go through trials? Because trials produce perseverance. Trials produce faith. Trials produce the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Trials produce obedience. Trials produce perfection. So, do you have to go through a trial? Yes. Do I have to go through a trial? Yes. Why? Because God loves us. Now, that doesn't make sense to some people. They think that God's a little pocket idol you pull out when you're hurting. It's kind of like Excedrin PM. You pull him out, you pray to him, and guess what? Your pain goes away. Well, that's not the God we worship. The God we worship lets us go through pain. Sometimes allows us, sometimes initiates difficulties for us to go through. Why? Because He loves us. But if you love somebody, you don't make them hurt, right? If you love somebody, you don't tell them something they don't want to hear. If you love somebody, you don't tell them that what they're doing is wrong. No, that's the way the world thinks. That's not the way God thinks. There's a purpose for trials because God is working in our lives. Hebrews chapter 12. We just read it. Let's go back to Hebrews chapter 12. I should have had you hold your place there. Hebrews chapter 12. We'll read up to verse 10 this time. So we'll start in Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 7. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7. If you endure... So this is point number 3. How do we endure trials? How do we endure trials? And then here in Hebrews chapter 12, it talks about it. How do we endure trials? If you endure chastening, if you endure correction, if you endure trials, if you endure tribulations, God deals with you as with a son. Because what son is there that his father does not chasten? And if you're without chastening, of which all are become partakers, then you are, the Authorized Version says, bastards, illegitimate. You're not real children. But we are real children, and that's why we are corrected by God. Furthermore, we had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? And Mr. Henderson in his sermonette talked about the names of God. One of the names of God is the Father of spirits. For they, our fathers, endured and chastened us for a few days as seemed good to them. But he, God, the Father of spirits, for our profit, so that we might be partakers of his holiness. No chastening, no correction, no trial seems pleasant or joyful at the present. It's painful, but afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness by those who've been trained by it. So how do we endure trials? We endure trials as sons, knowing that there's a purpose behind it. We endure trials knowing that it's good for us. It's just like eating your spinach. It's good for us, even though you may not like it. 1 Peter chapter 4. Back to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4. There's a really interesting, here in 1 Peter chapter 4, you notice that passage about judgment is on the house of God. But have you ever noticed what comes just before it or what comes after it? It's talking about trials. So why is there instruction about judgment is on the house of God in connection with trials? All right, 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which has come upon you, as though something strange has happened. Now, think about this. It's talking about judgment is on the church, and here it's talking about fiery trials. Do you begin to see a connection? The trials are a way of which God judges us. How are you going to deal with this trial? What are you going to do during the course of this trial? Or are you going to whine and complain? I'm not whining. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fire trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing has happened. Rejoice to the extent that you are a partaker of Christ's suffering. Rejoice. You are a partaker of Christ's suffering. He learned obedience by the things he suffered. You are learning obedience by the things you suffer. You are a partaker of what Christ had to go through. That is a reason to be glad. That means God's working with you. That means he loves you. That means he hasn't given up on you. If you're going through a rough time, it means God cares about you. If you're not going through a rough time, you might ask why. Well, maybe God's giving you a wide space and you have an opportunity to catch your breath. Rejoice to the extent that you're partakers of Christ's suffering. When his glory is revealed, you will be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. So notice it says, we rejoice because we're partakers of his suffering. We're reproached for the name of Christ. That means we're blessed. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part, he's blasphemed. On your part, he's glorified. But let none of you suffer like a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a busybody, because you deserve your suffering. You've done something wrong. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, if anyone is going through a trial, a health trial, a financial trial, an emotional trial, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. Notice, the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, we're the ones who are going through the trials, we're the ones who are partakers of the glory of Christ, we're the ones who have to go through the difficulties, and if it begins first with us, what shall be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved through trials, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Now, this passage tells us some very important things. It tells us we are to rejoice because we're partakers of Christ's suffering. It tells us that we're blessed if we're reproached for his name. It tells us that we should not be ashamed because we glorify God by the way we handle our trials. The way you handle your difficulties is a tribute to your relationship with God. And notice verse 19. Verse 19, Peter sums up the whole thing perfectly. He says, therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good. What are you supposed to do when you're going through a rough time? Whine and complain. No. You're supposed to commit your life to God by doing good. When you're going through a rough time, you're supposed to be doing good. Praying for others, giving to others, doing things for others. Do good when you're suffering. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in doing good as a faithful Creator. I urge you, brethren, to understand the purpose of trials is to create things in you. And when you are going through a trial, that is the ideal opportunity for you to commit yourself to God and to do good. Point number 4. We are to rejoice in trials. We are to rejoice in trials. You know, we just read there in 1 Peter chapter 4. And what did it say back in verses 13 and 14? Rejoice to the extent that you're a partaker of Christ's suffering, so that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you're reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. So we're supposed to rejoice when we're going through trials. We're supposed to rejoice because we're partakers of Christ's suffering. And when we suffer according to the will of God and commit our souls to Him, that is a cause to rejoice. The point that I was trying to make to Jeff over and over again is God's letting you go through this trial to restore your relationship with Him. For the last 35 years, you've ignored God. You've ignored the Bible. You've ignored the Sabbath. Now God's letting you be reconnected to Him. And the only thing that's causing it to happen is what? Your pain and your difficulty. The trial you're going through is bringing you back to God. Let it happen. Don't stop it from happening. I said, what would happen if God, the first time you prayed and God took away your pain? I said, would you still be reading your Bible? Would you still be praying? Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. The constitution of Christianity is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. The Sermon on the Mount is the heart and core of Christianity. The constitution of Christianity, Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are those who go through trials for righteousness' sake. What did it say? Christ learned obedience by the things that He suffered. What did it say? Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him. Blessed are you if you go through a trial, if you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. For yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We read in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, let's go back there. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, this is the account of Paul going to God and asking for healing. And God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we'll read verse 9. We'll pick up the thought there in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. God said, 3 times he besought the Lord, and God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I boast in my infirmities, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in infirmity. Is Paul saying he's a masochist? That he likes pain? No, he's saying, I realize there's a purpose behind this. It serves a purpose. It's perfecting something in my character. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I boast in my infirmities so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So he rejoices in his infirmities because he knows that God's dealing with him. All right, 1 Peter chapter 1. Reading a lot from 1 Peter, I realize that. 1 Peter and James say a great deal about trials. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 3. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, right after the introduction. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God the Father is Jesus Christ's God. He is the God of Jesus Christ. He's also the Father of Jesus Christ. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to His abundant mercy, whose mercy? God the Father's mercy, who according to His abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. This is the action of God the Father, the one who called you, the one who drew you to Jesus Christ, the one who made it possible for your whole membership in the family, the one that the family's named after, to an inheritance which is incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. We are kept by the power of God. Jesus Christ's prayer in John chapter 17 was, Holy Father, keep them through your name. Here it says, keep them through your power. It's the same thing. God's name is not a big post-it note on His chest. It's His power. We are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though now, for a little while, if needs be, you are grieved with various trials. We rejoice. If needs be, we're grieved with various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now you'll notice that I've quoted several scriptures several times. And what I've done is sometimes I quote the last half of it, and sometimes I quote the part leading up to it. Because you see that the way God orchestrates this, the entire Bible, if you start in Genesis and go to Revelation, is about the perfecting of the saints of God in holy, righteous character. And the only way that will happen is the stuff that's in us that has to come out has to be pressed out. We must go through trials in order for that holy, righteous character to be made in us. So if you're going through great pain, if you're having difficulty of any kind, rejoice. Let the trial do its job. Commit your soul to God and endure the trial. The way you deal with your trial is a tribute to God. Do good in your trial. Point number 5. Deliverance from trials. Deliverance from trials. The other day, Monica and I ordered pizza from Mark's Pizzeria. And some college student drives up in a beat-up old car and delivered the pizza. He brought it to us. The word deliver means to be brought, right? Brought out. Okay. Was Israel delivered from Egypt? Yes. Are we delivered from our trials? Yes. Sometimes the deliverance happens during the trial. Sometimes the deliverance happens at the end of the trial. Sometimes death is deliverance from a trial. Psalm chapter 34. Psalm chapter 34. Psalm chapter 34, verse 19, simply says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous." Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. Then why am I still suffering? Why am I still going through the trial? If God takes us out of our trial every time, if God delivers us out of our trial, it doesn't say out of, God delivers them. How can God deliver us out of our trial if we're still suffering? What does that mean? How can God do that? Wayne's still suffering. He's asked to be anointed. We've prayed. He's still suffering. He hasn't been delivered from his trial. He's still going through it. What does it mean to be delivered out of the trial? Notice 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is a very familiar passage with regard to trials. The first part of the chapter is talking about the examples of ancient Israel and the things that they did in the wilderness. It's talking about those who were idolaters. They sat down, they ate and they drank and they rose up to play. They committed sexual immorality. They tempted Christ. They were destroyed by serpents. They were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all those things are written for our admonition. Verse 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. Now all those things were written that happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. No temptation, no trial, no difficulty has overtaken you except such as common to man. Now when I look around this room and I think about some of the difficulties that you all have been through, the loss of a spouse, the loss of a child, the loss of a job, the loss of whatever it is, it's very, very painful. It's incredibly difficult to go through these trials, right? It says, no temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. But notice, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. God knows when to stop turning the lever on the vice. God knows at what point it takes for whatever is in you that's being removed to break. And if he goes any further, it will collapse what he's created in you. God will not burden you with a trial beyond what you can bear. The problem is we always think that the threshold is higher than God does. God, I can only take a trial this bad. And God says, no, we're going to ratchet it up a couple of notches. God knows what we can bear. Notice it says he will not tempt you beyond what you can bear, but will, with the temptation, will, with the trial, make the way of escape so that you can get out of it. No. Make the way of escape so that the trial can end. No. Make a way of escape so that you can bear it. The way of escape is not deliverance out of our trial, it's deliverance through the trial. When it says God delivers us out of all of them, it means he brings them to the end. He's not going to say, okay, halfway through the trial, I'm giving up on you. He will deliver us all the way to the end. And, if any of you, we could have a testimonial and just have people come up here and share some of their trials and share some of the things that we've learned as a result of our trials. And we could spend hours doing that. When you are going through a difficulty, it's God that's enabling you to bear it. I will share one quick story. We had a member of the congregation in Buffalo, Irene Edwards, who was a character. She could be one of the most loving, kind people. She could also say things the way they were. She developed stomach cancer, I believe. And it was very, very hard. It was painful on her. It was hard on her family. It was hard in many, many kinds of situations. I remember there was one time when she was very, very near to death and she was really sick. And her daughter asked me to come and pray. And it was one of those typical winter nights when the lake effect snow coming off of Lake Erie was dumping on Springville. And it was pretty bad. And when I got there, they were amazed that I had gotten there. God made it possible for me to get there. And it was funny, because when I got there, all she did was hold my hand. That's all Irene did. And then I asked her, I said, do you want me to read? She didn't respond, so I read. And she smiled. I will. You know, for anybody to watch somebody who's dying from something as hideous as cancer, you know how painful that is. And to know that God is able to provide a way of escape so that you can bear up under the trial. Lamentations. Since I'm already crying. Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3. I am looking forward to seeing Irene in the kingdom. Because I don't know whether she knew I was there. I know that that trial that she went through as a result of that had a huge impact on me. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 31. Notice what these words say. The Lord will not cast off forever. Though he causes grief, he will show compassion. And according to the multitude of his tender mercies, he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. God doesn't allow us to go through trials because he likes to. He does it because he has to. Because the end result of it will be to our benefit and to his glory. He does not willingly afflict nor grieve the Son of Man. And though he causes grief, he will show compassion. During the course of our trial, God will show compassion. You can write down John chapter 16, verse 33, a very familiar verse that we read whenever we're talking about the Passover. What did Christ say to his disciples? These things I've spoken to you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, underline, underline, underline. But be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. Please don't minimize the last part of that by focusing first on you will have tribulation. We know we'll have tribulation. Many of the afflictions of the righteous. I've overcome the world, is what he said. He will provide a way of escape so that we can bear it. He will give aid in affliction. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Another one of God's names, hearkening back to the sermonette, another one of God's names, and one that is a real joy. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. The God of all comfort. And notice, the God of all comfort, what does he do? He comforts us in our tribulations. I could end right there. I could end right there. He's the God of all comfort, and he comforts us in our tribulations. He does not grieve the Son of Man willingly. He shows compassion. He comforts us in our tribulations so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble. You know, when we are partakers of a trial and we commit our souls to God in doing good, what are we doing? We're comforting those who are going through affliction. Now, some things I have endured and some things I can comfort people over. And some things I have not endured, and I am an inept comforter. But God is the God of all comfort. And sometimes, some people have things in common, and they have endured them. And you can comfort one another. And what does it say we're supposed to do? God who comforts us in our tribulation so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves have been comforted. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so does our consolation and our salvation, which is effective in enduring the same sufferings. You know, some of you have chronic health problems. I sit there and I think about Mr. Moranville, who has chronic fatigue syndrome. Any given day, he wakes up and he will not know if he can make it through the day. The pain and the weakness will just overtake him to the point where he literally can't get out of bed. Every joint, every muscle, every nerve ending is tingling. And in the midst of all that, he's supposed to get up, write articles, pray, study, take care of his wife, be a grandfather to his grandchildren. And I know there are people who have that difficulty who can offer some comfort because they know exactly what it's like. As the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. Now, if we are afflicted, it is your consolation and strength, which is effective for enduring the same suffering for which we also suffer. Or if we are comforted, it's also our consolation and salvation. And our hope for you is steadfast, because we know that you are partakers of the sufferings, so also you are partakers of the consolation. How do we endure trials, brethren? By the God of all comfort, by Him providing us a way of escape. To conclude, there is a passage that talks about suffering. Let's go to Romans chapter 8. You know, when God allows us to go through a difficult time, when God allows us to go through a trial, He does so for a purpose. It is the purpose of creating holy, righteous character in us. It's to create cheerful endurance. It's to create righteousness. It's to create perfectness of faith. We understand that God delivers us from our trials by being comforting in our trials, by giving us what we need. But not only that, God gives us consolation so that we can console one another. In our trials, what are we supposed to do? Do good. Comfort others. Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 35. What shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall a trial, a distress, a persecution, a famine, a nakedness, peril, or sword, all of those are trials. All of those are difficulties. All of those are things that God allows us to happen to us in order to perfect our character. As it is written, for your sake, we're killed all day long. We die daily. We are accounted like sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all these things, we're more than conquerors through Him who loved us. I am persuaded that neither death nor life, which are trials, angels, principalities, powers, things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing is able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Jesus Christ our Lord. When we are in a severe trial and an affliction, brethren, we are in that trial because God the Father and Jesus Christ love us. We are going through that difficulty because they're working with us as sons to create their holy and righteous character. The trial will not separate us from God. Our reaction to that trial and our attitude in that trial is a testament and a tribute to how we feel about God. Let's make sure that when we're suffering, when we're going through difficulty, that we remember what Jesus Christ did. Let's conclude in Hebrews chapter 2. Okay. That's what I get for speaking off the top of my head. All right, let me try Hebrews chapter 12. Perhaps that's what I'm thinking. Yep, that's what it was. Hebrews chapter 12. Seeing as how we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all the heroes of faith of Hebrews chapter 11, let us lay aside the weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and run with endurance, run with patience, run with huponome, cheerful endurance, the race that is set before us. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who is allowing us to go through trials, who himself suffered to learn obedience, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Talk about a trial. He despised the shame. You talk about a trial. And he did what he calls us to do, to sit down at the right hand of the throne of God.